Very
We didn't
good.
have
Thank
enough,
you.
not enough time on spring break.
I know we're waiting for the summer, right?
It was horrible.
Same here. It's like, oh, this is a nice pace. Oh, it's spring break.
Correct.
Well, we started with, well, anybody, any questions, any comments, any concerns?
We have lab tonight, right?
We do have lab tonight. That's right. We're going to
Okay,
dissect a heart, a sheep heart.
Oh, okay. I'll have to be there for sure.
Oh,
Should I wear an apron?
No, I think it's all right. The eyeball is a little bit more challenging that it doesn't squirt, but I think we'd be all right. And we have glasses in case you want glasses.
Okay.
The heart is pretty firm to cut through. That should be all right.
Okay.
I know. Bring your strong arms, maybe.
Okay.
Strong cotton fingers. Swiss Army knife. Well, how did you guys feel like you did on the test?
I have a question. Phyllis is asking, do we all need to show up? Is that a requirement?
No, it's all optional. The in-classes, the in-persons are optional. Depending on, I think if you want to transfer to UC, you should be there. I just have that sort of the challenge right now with the organizations. They're not quite clear yet how they're dealing with it.
All right, thanks.
So how did you guys do on the test?
Good, surprisingly.
Good. I know. Once I graded it, it looked better, I hope.
Yeah.
Yes, a lot.
I know. I haven't found the button that I can say, don't show the grade yet before I go through it again. I hope not too many people freaked out.
I was a little disappointed until you graded it.
Well, but afterwards you were all right, Jeff?
Afterwards, I was all right. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's why I tried to grade them as fast as I could. So
appreciate that.
You guys didn't have to worry about too much. No, I think everybody did pretty good. I have a few people.
Yeah. When I first read the exam and saw the results, it was really challenging. It was really complicated, made me have to think through a lot of things. But then as I went through, I thought I understood everything, but it was really challenging, but I definitely learned a lot. Good.
Well, that's the main goal of the exam, is that it's sort of a final go through, learning some more. That's why I give you enough time. You can have it open book. And now we can put these muscles and bones to the side. So we have a little more room in our brain, and we can fill it up with more stuff. So the week before the break, we did the heart and we did the blood vessels. How was that for you guys? Was that all right? Was that challenging? You guys want to have some questions on that? Want to go through that a little bit?
What were we talking about again?
The heart and the blood vessels. That was last week. Yeah, it's a long time ago now, right?
Yeah.
Well, if you don't have too many problems with that, what I can do is start maybe with, and we can always go back, but maybe we'll start with the test review type material for the final, the last test. So the tests are not cumulative. All right, so all the material that we've had so far up to the heart, you can sort of put a little bit in the back burner in the brain. And usually how these topics like anatomy, physio, especially anatomy work, it builds on one another. So next time, if you study that again, or if you come across and you keep your material, then you can sort of build on what you have, and you'd be probably surprised how much stuff you remember and retain when it gets applicable. So that's how I work this thing. So you can now not worry about the muscles anymore. Now we're going to start, well, heart is a muscle, so we do worry about a muscle a little bit, but we're starting with the heart. We did that already. Now this week we're going to have blood and immune system. That's kind of an interesting, so spend a little time on that. There is no oh, the blood is a labeling, but that's a very small labeling. So the labeling is very minimal on that. The questions are more extensive, and it's more of a theoretical sort of chapter, those two chapters. But before we go deeper on that, I want to show you the test review. See, here's the rest here, what we do. We don't have this test. This is not for you guys. Your test is down here, test 3. I teach this class also as a hybrid, so there I don't have a lab test for those. But as you work your way through the material, I want you to go to the test review. And if possible, print out this test review right here that you have. Because on this test review, it's 5 pages, it's fairly long, but I have everything spelled out that is going to be on the written part of the test. And it's not just like it's this topic, it's more like what is an EKG tracing, and I spell out what is. Now, if you read this without having studied the material at all or having gone through it, it might look a little strange and not make that much sense. But once you've gone through the material or parallel, I want you to make sure that those bullet points you're definitely understanding, because that's what is going to be asked of you on the test or on part of the test, because the final exam is going to be, let me get out of here. How do I get out of here? Oh, there you go. The final exam is going to be 25 questions of the test review here, and then about 40 almost questions of anatomy terms that we're going through it. So it's sort of a combination between test 1 and test 2. And so there's also then for the anatomy portions of it, the anatomy term, there's also then a term list here that you can also download or print out. I will print this out if you can. It takes a moment here. Sorry about that. If you come to lab, I'll give you this term list in the lab as well as a printout. But it's essentially all the terms that are accumulated from what we're doing now in terms of the coloring and labeling. And they're even grouped in heart and blood. And then the final exam will be similar to the second exam. I'll show you parts and you tell me what is the structure. Now here we basically talk about structure. We're not going to talk about landmarks anymore and bones and muscles. And so that's how the test works. So also print this out if you can. And if you go through the color and labeling, color and labeling exercises, I want you to, if you have this list here present, then you can see what terms are harder for you to keep and what are easier, and then you can focus your studies that way. Does that make some sense?
Yeah.
That's all right.
Yes.
That's fairly straightforward, I hope. But make sure you utilize the bullet points, because what I want with that is that you can sort of relax a little bit, hopefully enjoy the material somewhat, and focus on the material, understanding the material, and then the quizzes or the questions afterwards. And then you solidify what's going to be on the test of asked of you. And so you have it really spelled out, that I don't want you to worry and put too much anxiety in that, like, oh my God, I need to know all of this stuff. Because blood and the immune system, it gets pretty intricate, as well as the brain. It's very interesting stuff. But if I ask you to know everything, we can't focus that much on the teaching part of the material. At least that's my experience. All right. That's pretty all right. Do you guys want to go through the heart briefly, or are you guys all right with the heart?
I would love to go through it. I've done it before, and I found a diagram online last night that was helpful, but repetition is key for me.
Yeah. Let's see. Where is the heart? Can you see the heart?
Yeah.
Yes. I think.
Yes.
So as we go to the heart, let me see how far we go. We got to have a little anatomy, and then we have a little bit of physiology. So a little bit of how the heart, what's part of the heart, and then how does the heart function. First, we looked at the positioning. It's in the middle. It's in the middle of the chest. It's between the lungs, nicely encased by the soft lungs on each side. Below is the diaphragm, which was the main breathing muscle. That's that piece down in here. And in front of it is the breastbone, the sternum. And if you have a question, just butt in and interrupt me, okay? The lower part of the heart, the pointing down part of the heart is known as the apex. So it sort of points down a little bit, and the base, the wider part, is on the top. And so that would be the base is superiorly and the apex is pointing inferiorly. A little bit more on the left side. That's why when we get to the lungs, we see that the left lung only has 2 lobes of lungs, and the right lung will have 3 lobes of the lungs. So that's one of those organs that's not quite symmetrically in the body. The heart is very well protected. It has to be, because it's sort of a fist-size organ that squeezes, squeezes, relax, squeezes, relax, squeeze, relax. And when it squeezes, it pushes the contents, the chambers on the inside together, and they come closer together. And that will push the liquid inside, which is the blood, out of the heart in a direction that we want to go, which then we'll talk about the valves to make sure that blood flows in the direction we want it to flow and not the other direction. And so you have a lot of friction that's happening in the heart, a lot of movement that could potentially create friction. It's like if you take your hands and rub them together, it gets warm. And if that would be in the heart, that would be a problem, because you get inflammation at some point. When you create heat, you create inflammation. And so we have this fantastic way of protecting multiple organs, but we mostly talk about it in the heart and then in the lungs, and then briefly also in the gut. And that protection is called the serous membrane system. Where is the serous membrane? Here, serous membranes right in here. And so they are basically, it looks like it's 2 membranes that are attached, one to the heart itself or to the organ, and the other one to the chest wall. And in between those 2 layers, we have a little bit of a liquid called the serous fluid. And that fluid is glidy. And so that helps us not have friction. So if we have a smooth fluid that can glide, then the heart can pump and move its way around and not create any heat and any friction. Now, in reality, this is not 2 membranes. In reality, it is 1 membrane, 1 contiguous membrane that is here. You could see better in the lungs how it is folded inward, how here it's folded, and then one part of the membrane is on the lung and the other part of the membrane is on the chest wall. In the heart, it's the same thing. The visual you have, see here, you could see it real well. When you put a fist into a balloon, you sort of understand how that system works. So if we cut a heart, we think it's 2 membranes, but if we look at the top here, it's actually 1 membrane that's continuous. In the heart, it's known as the the pericardium, and in the lungs, it's called the pleura, like here. And in the gut, we're going to call that the peritoneum. We're going to get there when we get to the gut. The 2 membranes have 2 different names. The one that's on the organ, on the viscera, so to speak, it's called the visceral layer. And then the part of the membrane that's on the chest wall on the outside is known as the parietal layer. So that's kind of an interesting system of how we can sort of enclose organs and make them, we want them separate from other organs. And we also want to be able to, like in the heart, it will be the friction. In the lungs, we actually get the suction, because that system suctions the lungs against the chest wall. And then when we breathe, which is expanding the chest wall, the lungs will follow with it and air will flow into the lung. And in the gut, in the peritoneum, we use this membrane to really organize the gut and make sure it doesn't get tangled up, because it's a long tube that needs to be well organized. So it's a pretty cool thing, this system. Again, any questions, just butt in. And then we get to the heart wall itself. So we have the heart is enclosed in what we call the pericardial sac. And the outer layer of that sac is also it's a fibrous layer that anchors the heart. The outer layer is most likely fibrous, outer layer of an organ that anchors the organ into the position where it's got to be. And then that works together here with the parietal pericardium. That's that outer layer of the serous membrane. And then here, see here how it's folding it in. And then next one, we have the epicardium. And the epicardium is, epi means above, cardium means heart. And that's basically the visceral layer of the pericardium. So that's the same. The epicardium is the same as the visceral layer of the pericardium. And then below that, deeper, we have the myocardium, and myo refers to muscle. So that's the heart muscle itself. And then deepest on the inside, we have the endocardium, and endo means on the inside. And so that's the innermost layer. That then below that, we have the chamber, the heart chambers, and that's where we fill the heart with the blood and make the blood go through the heart. As it comes to blood vessels, we often hear these terms artery and veins, and arteries are known to carry oxygenated blood, and veins are known to carry deoxygenated blood. However, when we really get to the analysis, the arteries are actually vessels that leave the heart, and veins are vessels that bring the blood back to the heart. The reason why they're separate is the main reason is that the anatomy needs to be different between the veins and the arteries, because the arteries are exposed to this hydrostatic pressure, which is the heart squeezing and forcing the blood out of the heart into the arteries. That's a lot of force. And so those walls of the arteries are, generally speaking, thicker to be able to withstand that hydrostatic pressure. The veins, on the other hand, are essentially conduits. They're tubes that feed the blood back to the heart. So they're not really having any pressure exposed to. They have different things like valves, for example. They run through muscles that squeeze them, and then that will push the blood forward towards the heart. So those vessels are much thinner. And then in between, we have what we also know as exchange vessels. Those are capillaries. And that's where those are very leaky, and those go through the tissues, and that's where the blood sort of seeps into the tissues and feeds the tissues with nutrients and with oxygen, and also brings back the byproducts of making energy, for example, the carbon dioxide, and also other waste products. So that's a little bit about the blood vessels. We have a little bit more coming in the next chapter on that. Then we look at the heart chamber. So let's slice the heart open and look at the inside. So we have 4 chambers all together. We have 2 on each side. So the heart's kind of a double pump. We have 2 atria, and atria means 4. Receiving is a receiving chamber. I think it means 4 room. So that's where the blood sort of comes in and sort of pools together. And then from there, it feeds into what's known as the ventricle. There's one on the right and one on the left. And then when a heart squeezes, see how thick these walls are here? That heart squeezes and closes out these chambers, and then the blood will have to move forward either into the pulmonary trunk here or into the aorta here. I will talk about those vessels, I think, in the next chapter. I said it was two pumps at once, so it's a double pump, because one part of the pump, this here, feeds the blood from the body into the lungs. And we know that then the lungs as the pulmonary circuit. So that feeds the blood from the heart, the right side of the heart, into the lungs. And in the lungs, it has the gas exchange. It gets rid of the carbon dioxide and fills up with oxygen. And then when it's nice and red and oxygenated, it will go back into the heart on the left side, first the atria, and then feed into the ventricle, so to slowly trickle in. And actually, the atria squeeze a little bit at the end to push it all in and before the ventricles contract. So it's kind of a really cool system, actually. And then when the ventricles here squeeze, or when the heart squeezes, this right blood gets pushed out into the aorta and goes through the entire body and feeds the body with oxygen and nutrients. We know that then as the systemic circuit. This circuit here looks like on the diagram it goes down, but it also feeds the head and everything and the arms. It's more as to just show the 2 circuits. The pulmonary circuit only goes to the lungs, and its sole purpose is basically to get the blood filled with oxygen and get rid of the carbon dioxide and other gases, waste that we can breathe out. Good. That's pretty much for that part. And then we have to talk about the heart valves, because we want the blood to flow from the atria to the ventricle, then out to the great vessels. They call these ones that come right to the heart, they call these the great vessels. And if the heart squeezes and there's blood here into the atria, in the ventricle, sorry, and we don't have any door or any valve closing, the blood will go right back into the atria and up here too, but it wouldn't be efficient. It would be sort of leaky. And so in order to not have that happen, we got this set of valves that are attached, that are between the atria and the ventricle on both sides. And as the heart contracts, these valves are actually really cool. See, they have these little tendons attached and this muscle down here, which is here, down in here. And as the heart muscle contracts, it squeezes, and squeezing makes it a little smaller. And like sails, like in sailing, these strings let go a little bit, and the valves sort of cover what's the opening between the ventricles and the atria, and so no blood can move back into the atria, unless of course we have a murmur, which is we have a little bit of a leak, either a hole or a hole in it, or it can't close completely. And so that's one set of valves. On the right side, those valves are known as the atrioventricular valves. So they're between the atria and the ventricle. On the right side, we can also call it the tricuspid valve, and on the left side, the mitral valve. The wording comes, cuspid means little cusp. These are flaps. And on the right side, we have 3 of those flaps that create this closure. And on the left side, we only have 2 of these flaps. And instead of calling it bicuspid, no, you can actually call it bicuspid valve here. But they also call it mitral valve, because when they did all this stuff in the Middle Ages, at some point, they were looking at the bishop's mitre, the bishop's hat, which sort of closes like 2 things coming together on top somehow. So they called that the mitral valve. So that's just an old terminology. That's pretty much those valves. And so when those valves close, they make a sound. And that will be the LUP sound, the first sound. Because the other valves are here after the blood leaves the ventricle and goes into the great vessels. There's valves here guarding the great vessels, so blood that is pushed out and is not quite reaching the end here will fall back into the ventricle, but now it doesn't fall into the ventricle, actually sits on these little valves here. They call them the semi-lunar valves. Where are they? Here they are, the semi-lunar valves right in here. And they call them semi-lunar valves because this looks kind of, when you look from above or below, it looks kind of a little bit like a half moon. When you know, after a lot of wine and squinting the eyes, then it looks like that. So they call them half moon valves, semi-lunar valves. And so they are here to prevent backflow of the blood when after the ventricles contract and then they relax, the blood will not fall back into the ventricles. And again, that would be not sufficient. Another thing that's actually really cool about this system is a little bit of blood will be sitting in these little cusps, like puddles on the street of rainwater, and they create a little bit of weight pushing them down, and so that the heart muscle needs to contract a little bit harder before it can push these doors open, and that creates a little bit more increased hydrostatic pressure and pushes that blood a little bit more forceful into the body. And we gotta, you know, go up into the brain and all that, so we gotta be pretty forceful with that squeezing thing. When those valves close, we call that the dub sound. Where is the lub dub? Where is the lub dub? Here. So the lub sound is when the AV valves close, and the dub sound is the second one. That's after. So the lub is right before the ventricles contract, and then the dub is right after the ventricles contract. So those are lub dub, lub dub, lub dub. So I had a couple of questions on question 14, I think that was. And the answer is that the valves are both, the sounds are both made when the valves close, not when the valves open, when the valves close. And the lob is the AV valve, and the dub is the semilunar valve. So if you got that wrong, go back and check on that. Good. So that's the valves and that's the sounds. And I think we already briefly talked about the two circuits. So we have the pulmonary circuit, that's the right side, and that feeds the lung where we can exchange the gases. And the only term here, what we need to know is that where are we here? As we exit the right ventricle, we're going to call it the pulmonary trunk that we feed in. And let me put a different picture up that's better to see here. The pulmonary trunk right in here. And the trunk is usually a vessel that very soon afterwards splits into two or more vessels. And so the first part is known as the pulmonary trunk. And as soon as it splits, we call it then the pulmonary arteries. And so this is where you have to be careful, because on diagrams, this is often blue, but it is an artery because it leaves the heart. So be clear about that, definition. On the other side, we have in the back of the heart, we get these vessels coming in on both sides, actually, that go in like that. You see the holes coming out there on both sides. And those are all known as the pulmonary veins. Even though then they are red because they have oxygen, they still call them veins because they feed into the heart. And so, and the anatomy is a little bit different. The walls are thinner on the veins, and on the arteries, the walls are thicker. So that's the terminology with that. That's the pulmonary circuit. And then the systemic circuit goes through the whole body. So as we have the left side of the heart contract, and the ventricle squeezes the heart right into the aorta, and that's a big arch here that goes over the heart. And so we have a part that called the ascending aorta, the aortic arch, or the arch of the aorta, and then the descending aorta. And then from there it goes into the stomach area, the abdomen, so we call it that, and the abdominal aorta. And as we go further down to the bottom of towards the pelvis, in the pelvis somewhere we split, and then we go to each side, and we call it the femoral arteries down there. But we'll do that in the next chapter. We have three vessels that come off the aortic arch. On the right side, we have a brachiocephalic trunk. And on the left side, we have two vessels. One goes into the head, called the common carotid, left common carotid, and the other one goes into the armpit and then the arm. And we call that here the subclavian artery because it goes right underneath the clavicle. Further down, the arteries always change names, and further down it will be called the axillary artery and then the brachial artery. On the right side, we only have that trunk coming off. And again, actually, this should be called trunk. Why is this called artery? Well, see, sometimes the pictures, so some of them will call it artery, but technically speaking, you will call it a trunk, because right after it, it splits up into two. And instead of coming straight from the arch, we're going to split up here, go to the right subclavian, and then the right common carotid. So that's, again, a little bit different because the heart's not sitting right in the center of the chest. This is a nice picture with all the names on it. So this is good when you go through the lab to label. I had to put these in here. So there's a ledger over here what these little LC, LCCs, and PT means. And then the other thing we have is we have to be able to feed the heart muscle itself. So one would think, well, all the blood goes through the heart, so there's blood around. You could just take from that and feed the heart muscle. But that's not how it works, because there's a lot of pressure and a lot of movement going on. We need to feed the heart muscle through a different method or different means. And so right at the base of the aortic, of the ascending aorta, we have coronary arteries that come out. We have one on the right side and one on the left side. And right and left is always viewed from the perspective of the patient or the perspective of the person. So if we look from the front, which this picture is, the right is on our left and the left is on our right, because it's the person that we look at. So if it's in your own heart, your right is on your right and your left is on your left. But we have two of them. One is the left coronary artery and one is the right coronary artery. The ones that I want you to look at and study are these coronary arteries. And then there's all these names here, but we basically focus on two more names. We focus on the circumflex artery, which is one that goes around this way. It's not the best picture on this, but in the lab, we're going to see it. We have big hearts that we can look at it. So the circumflex artery goes around between the ventricle and the atria, and then it feeds the ventricle in the front, and we call that the left anterior descending artery. So those are the only ones that I really want you to know. We also have a venous system that picks up all the blood. The arteries, if you look at a textbook or on the computer, the arteries and the veins have pretty much the same names. So there's going to be a left anterior descending vein as well. Or and the big thing there is, though, all the blood gets collected that is used up by the heart muscle and then pools in an area right before it gets dumped actually into the right atria on this side, and that part is known as the coronary sinus. The reason why I put that up is because of the word sinus, and the word sinus means chamber, and so it could be used in areas where we collect blood, for example, but it also is used like in the head where we have the different sinuses, which are resonant chambers that help us create voice. And you probably have heard of it or have experienced if you have a sinus infection. That's when the bacteria, get stuck down in those chambers and can't escape. And that's a lot of pressure and that's painful. All right, so that's kind of the anatomy. And from there, I want to go a little bit into the physiology. So the heart's very interesting. It's got its own nervous system, so to speak. It's very independent that way. It has on top of the atria here on the right atria, it's got what's known as the sinoatrial node. And the sinoatrial node is basically nerve cells that have leaky calcium channels. And they create, and calcium is an ion, and ions are charged. And so they kind of leak these charged ions, and at some point, whenever you have positive negatives, you have sort of kind of electricity speaking, and at some point, the positives and negatives are different enough that it will create a nerve impulse. The way that the nerve impulse really works, we're going to talk about that in the nerve chapter, which comes in a couple of weeks, I think. And so this sinoatrial node creates about 60 to 70 impulses per minute. And when an impulse happens, the nerve electricity gets sent to the heart muscle, and then the heart muscle contracts. It's kind of like you're putting your hand into the socket, don't do it, finger into the socket or get a little electrocuted, and you kind of like, it contracts the muscles. And so this is then when the atria contract a little bit at the end of the relaxed phase, where then it squeezes the blood down into the ventricle. And then at the bottom of the atria, we have another node called the atrioventricular node, which is easy to remember because it's between the atria and the ventricle. And that enhances or re-establishes the impulse and sends a nerve impulse down into the ventricle, down what this is called the interventricular septum, because it's in between the ventricle, interventricular. And it goes around each ventricle to then have the ventricles contract very nicely as a collective, they call it a functional syncytium. We'll talk about that in a sec here. So there's a few different names. This is called the bundle of His, and then when it changes, it's called the bundle branches, and as it turns corner and goes around, we call it the Purkinje fibers. That's just, technical stuff. I'm not going to hold you too accountable for that, but we have to give these things names so we can talk about them. The heart muscle fibers are very interesting because they actually have these they are connected here, but then they have these called intercalated discs, which let the ions travel through them. So basically what that means is we have holes in those muscles or doors, little doors that let all the nerve impulse go through all the muscles at once. And so the heart muscle, all the fibers contract as a unit, and they call that the functional syncytium. And that's important because otherwise you would have not a uniform contraction of all those fibers, and the heart muscle would be sort of spasming all over the place a little bit. And so that's really a cool thing. That's only happening in the heart, that thing. The other part here is, I said that the heart has its own conduction system, so its own nerve impulses. But sometimes, you know, your heart pumps faster than just the 60 or 70 per minute. And sometimes it pumps harder or less hard, depending on your activity or your mental state. And so the brain influences the heart muscle contraction in terms of speed, as also in terms of the force of the contraction. We call it the vagus nerve is parasympathetic. When we get to the nervous system, parasympathetic are nervous system parts that relax us, that make us like meditation type relaxing. And the sympathetic is the other side, and that's nerve influence that speeds things up and makes it stronger and faster. So that's more the irritating part. That's like when you drive down the freeway, you have to be really alert. That's a sympathetic compared to being, you know, on the couch and watch some relaxing movie. Not a horror movie, a relaxing movie. Good. Any questions to that? No? Then let's keep going. The electrocardiogram, the EKG, is this, we all know this this graph here from, you know, ambulances and other means, but sometimes it's even on the doors. We have a few different parts. We have a P wave here, we have a QRS complex, and we have a T wave. I don't know why they started with a P, but that's how they did it. When you look at this little bump here, the electrocardiogram is the electricity going through the heart. So you see here, the P is when the atria contract a little bit. Right before the heart muscle on the bottom, the ventricles squeeze and contract, which is the QRS complex. That's when the heart contracts. So that's ventricular excitation is the technical term, or ventricular depolarization. We'll talk about the term depolarization when you get to the brain or the nervous system. And then the T wave is the end of this ventricular contraction. And we call that the end of the ventricular excitation or ventricular repolarization. That's, again, we talk about repolarization further down the line. Right now, it's a little too complex to get through that whole thing. But so the atria contract, the ventricles contract, and then the ventricles relax. We also have an atrial relaxation, but that's not shown because it's right in this time frame, which, you know, is overpowered by the strong ventricular contraction. When a heart muscle contracts, we call it systole. And when a heart muscle relaxes, we call it diastole. And so the heart continuously contracts, relax, contract, relax, contract, relax. As we relax, the blood flows in from the atria to the ventricle. As we contract, the blood flows out of the ventricles into the great vessels. You probably heard of these terms from systole and diastole in terms of the blood pressure. Systolic blood pressure is when it squeezes, so that's when the hydrostatic pressure is its strongest. And diastole is when the heart muscle relaxes, and so the blood pressure is really the pressure wave that is pushed against an artery, where we measure it by the brachial artery in the upper arm, mostly. We can also measure it on the wrist, but it's not as accurate. But that vibration, that pushing against the vessel, is what the blood pressure is, and then it measures that pressure against the blood pressure cuff. And so in systole, when the heart muscle contracts, that's the highest force. So that's the strongest way that blood pushes against the vessel. And when it's relaxed, there's no force basically, and it just flows through it. And we measure then the diastolic pressure. So the diastolic pressure is always lower than the systolic pressure. We can also listen to the heart. We have heart sounds. And this basically just shows you, we're not getting too far into it, but it shows you where you could place the stethoscope so you can really hear the different valves well. And so I just wanted to put that in, so in case clinically, you know, have a reference for that. When a heart valve is not, there's a little bit distorted, it can either not fully open or it cannot fully close. So it's not fully open, we call it stenosis. And if it can't fully close, we call it insufficiency. Because the opening part will make it harder to get the blood from the atria to the ventricle, and the closing, not fully closing, will mean that some blood goes back into the atria. And it's interesting, like you can, like when you listen to the heart and you have a murmur, you can like sort of, you know, time it if it, when the sh, which is like, you know, you go lupped up, sh, and if you heard a sh, then that's a little bit of a murmur. So if the sh is before the lub, we know it's a stenosis. If the sh is after the lub, most likely a insufficiency. And we call that turbulence at the block. Well, the sound comes from the turbulence. Turbulence is like when you look at a river, at the edge of the river, the water kind of circles a little bit. That creates turbulence, and that can create potentially some sound. Good. All right, so that brings us to the cardiac cycle. And the cardiac cycle is basically what we already talked about. And I would just give it some names. We have first, well, we started as we are relaxed, and the blood flows from the atria into the ventricle. We call that ventricular filling. And then at the end of that moment, the atria contract a little bit, and they call that the atrial kick. So that pushes all the blood that we can have from the atria into the ventricles. It's about 20% of the filling. So it's not minimal. And then after that happens, we have what we call an isovolumetric ventricular contraction. Iso means same, volume refers to the space, the volume, how big it is. And so this is a situation where the heart muscle starts contracting, but no blood goes anywhere. If you're looking down here, oh, shoot, I shouldn't have done that. Oh, shoot, it's a PowerPoint. Never mind. I have to figure it out later. But if you look down here, in an isovolumetric, all the valves here are closed. They're not open because no blood moves anywhere, but the ventricles are starting to contract and build up pressure. And at some point, the pressure is strong enough that it pushes the semilunar valves open, and we call them that ventricular ejection right in here. So that's when the blood flows out of the ventricle. And after that, we have what's known as an isovolumetric relaxation. Again, the myocardium relaxes at that point, but the intraventricular pressure falls below the atrial pressure, which closes the semilunar valves. And again, for a brief moment, all the valves are closed. Before then, the AV valves open, the atrioventricular valves open, and the ventricles fill back up with blood. And then we're back at the top. And so it's a continuous cycle that goes on and on. Does that make some sense? No sound is good sound.
Sort of.
So I know, right? We got to do it a few times. We do it again tonight. So don't, you know, we can do it all day today, essentially. If you have more questions too, you just give me a shout and we'll have a session on it. And then the one measurement that I want us to know is the cardiac output. And the cardiac output is like how much blood does the heart pump in 1 minute? And that's an equation of how many times it pumps, the heart rate, as well as how much blood each time it pumps, the stroke volume, that is. So when we're resting right now, the heart pumps around 70 beats per minute and pumps about 70 milliliters per beat. I don't know what a milliliter is in ounces. But what's important here is that we can look at that. We can briefly from 70, if we're doing a sprint and we got to run away from a lion or something that's really bad, we can go up to 180 beats per minute briefly. And we can stretch the heart muscle that we can double the volume that it beats each time. So we can go at rest from pumping about 5 liters, which is, somebody help me, how much is a gallon? I forgot. It's probably about 1.5 gallons, more or less. But we can go all the way up to 25 liters. So we can do a 5 times more pumping if we have to briefly per minute to, you know, to feed the organ, to feed the tissue with oxygen, to give it energy and all of that. That we, you know, that we can continue running. We can do 5 times more than the resting one, but of course only briefly. So I've always find that very significant, because, you know, we all know how it feels when we run really hard and almost get out of breath, but that's there. So that's pretty cool. All right, now you see it?
Yes.
Oh God. Well, let's go through it real fast. So this is the layers we talked about, the tunicas. Then here are all the valves that go upward, the muscular pump that goes through the muscle that only pushes the blood upward. And then the respiratory pump picture is a little bit, well, actually, that's the best picture I found. When the lungs expand, the blood gets suctioned up a little bit towards the lungs.
Are these slides available somewhere?
They're in the booklets.
Just in the booklet, okay.
Yeah, unfortunately, that's just in the booklet. This we skipped. This talks about the metatiriole going through it and the capillaries being the perfusion. Here it doesn't perfuse the tissues because the tissues don't need the oxygen and nutrients. Here you see these little sphincter muscles that can close, meaning here they're closed, here they're open. And then here's the slide that I talked about, the lymphatics, how the lymphatic system goes, all perfuses through, or the finger-like projections go through the capillary system and they pick up the excessive fluid. Here's a little slide talking about the osmosis in case you need to review that. That's also in the cell chapter, we talk about that. And then from there, we went, that's where we stopped. From there, we just go basically into naming. I do not make you study any of the names for the vessels. I think except for like the aorta and the brachiocephalic trunk, a few of them, they're on the list. But because for the most part, you have the name sort of be descriptive. You see renal artery goes to the kidneys. Iliac artery is in the, iliac is by the ilium here. Then the femoral arteries below go to the femur. The axillary arteries is in the armpit, the axilla, the brachial in the brachium, radial by the radius, ulna by the ulna. So this is again where your muscles and bones, your bones come in handy, and also in chapter 1 that we talked about, the regions of the body come in handy. See, femoral, we have tibial, we have peroneal is an old word that we use for fibula or fibular. That's maybe a little bit off. But I'm not making you study all of those for the test. I just want you to reference them back because the names are so similar. The brain's kind of interesting. The brain gets fed by the internal carotids, which go right up in here. But then also the internal carotid, but then also we have the vertebral artery, which goes through the vertebra in the neck, and that feeds the back of the brain. So the front of the brain, middle of the brain is by the carotid, and then the back of the brain is fed by the vertebral artery, which comes off of the subclavian. What's subclavian artery? What's interesting with that also, that brain has a connection between the vertebral artery right in here, a circle of Willis, they call that, the vertebral artery and the internal carotid. And so it can balance out the blood necessary in which part of the brain. So that's kind of cool there. So it brings blood from both sides. We already briefly talked about the blood pressure. Blood pressure is a pressure that's pushed against the wall. And we measure that. We have a systolic and a diastolic. The systolic is higher and the diastolic lower. We want to be around 120/80. But as we get older, those figures go up a little bit, even in normal circumstances. And then briefly talking about arteriosclerosis, which can raise the blood pressure. because the vessels get narrower, they don't get as wide, the patency is not as big, and they get stiffer and less elastic. And so that those two things make the blood pressure go up. First, the systolic pressure goes up, but then later on in the pathology, the diastolic pressure also goes up. Wait a minute. No, it's the other way around. Sorry about that. But the diastolic first, and then the systolic goes up. But if it's still at rest, then it remains high at rest, and so that's when the pathology gets a little bit more severe. And we definitely want to know about our blood pressure, want to do stuff about it, but mostly it's talking exercise and good nutrition, not too much fat, and all of that kind of stuff. Good. That's it for that. How is that for you guys? The only last thing I want to briefly say is this week we have what we do. Let me see if that's actually this week. Come on, guy, be a little faster. Week 10, we do a blood pressure thing. And so I'm not making you go measure blood pressure, but I'm talking a bunch about blood pressure here. And what I do want you to do, we see these are all the things we can do about blood pressure to make it better, since blood pressure is one of those problems that we have in society. But what I do want us to do is I do want us to measure our salt intake for 1 week or 5 days or something, because that's the most problematic thing, I think, besides maybe a lack of exercise probably, but the salt intake is generally really high in our society. And I would like for us to keep track of our salt intake for 5 days and just, keep track as much as you can, check on the food labels, sort of measure how much salt you put in, just focus on that a little bit, and write it down, and then sort of add up how much is your daily total of what you take. Again, more or less. We can't be fully exact, and I don't want this to be a full scientific thing. I just want us to build the awareness a little bit more. And then as a part 2, I have a couple of questions I'd like you guys to ponder on and answer, and reflect on a little bit. So that's sort of the health kit thing that I want you to do this week. And I think since it's a weekly thing, I got to put it up to the 16th, because since it's a whole week, some people started at the end of the week. So this is going to be due 4/16, not 4/9. So you have a little extra time. So because not everybody starts today. And then the last thing is, I want to understand if you guys are doing all right with the pathology project. Have you guys been connecting with each other? If there are questions or there are problems with that? If not here, please make sure to reach out to me so I can facilitate. I'm trying to keep track in the back, but I'm not, intruding too much, but I'm here for questions. So once you figured out the pathology, the disease that you want to deal with, and once you allocated one of the 3 parts to a member, either what is the pathology, how does medicine deal with it, or how can I deal with it, then now I want you to go and do research if you haven't started yet. And I want you to use, go to the channels, go to Mayo Clinic, WebMD. I even start with Wikipedia. But I want you to collect information for a minimum of 5 sources. So it's a little bit of a cross section. And then I want you to compile that information in a presentation, either, Google Slides or PowerPoint. Make sure you write down the sources at the bottom. So I can go back and double check them myself if I like to. And then once we have the presentation made, which is what we're doing now, making a draft presentation, then you send me that as soon as you have, and I'll give you some feedback on, and you kind of revise that a little bit. Most of the time, it's too much words, too many words, it's too small of a print, it's not enough pictures. Use as many pictures as you can to explain things. make slides that you don't just read from, that are just sort of main words that you can then take to make a video presentation after. Because at the end, you present your findings and you make a voiceover video presentation as a group. I want each member to not speak more than 2 or 3 minutes, which, you know, sometimes then turns into 4 or 5 minutes, but, you know, that's okay. We want to be brief though, like an elevator speech, we sort of call that sometimes, and we can, you know, get right to the point and explain what we want to explain. And I want you to make a group video with it. And most of the previous ones, since we are on video versus in the classroom, have used Zoom. If you have a Zoom account, you can get the people in, you can share and make a video with that. So that's probably the easiest at this point to do. And then once we have the video, we put it all up and look at each other's videos and then give each other some feedback and learn from each other, basically. Good? Questions?
That's good.
And
No,
I do-
no more
I-
questions. That's good.
I'll wait until after everyone.
Thank
leaves
you.
the room.
Thank you.
Okay, good.
Yeah, thank you.